Welcome back to another deep dive. And today we're going underwater,
Ooh.
but not in a fun way, not a Jacques Cousteau kind of way.
Yeah.
Uh,
Not a vacation.
no, more of a Submarine's 1960s kind of way.
Yeah, a little darker.
Yeah, a little bit on
A
the
little more intense.
intense side. So you sent me this great list from Listverse, 10
Ah.
sobering submarine incidents of the 1960s, and it's perfect for this kind of deep dive because it's it's something that I think is in the back of a lot of people's minds. Like, submarines are really cool, but also kind of terrifying.
They're inherently kind of scary, right?
Yeah, like you're in
Yeah.
a metal tube underwater.
Yeah. And it's a technology that's pushing the limits of what we can do, right?
Yeah.
Like being able to stay underwater for extended periods of time, going to depths that would crush a human being just instantly. So there's always that element of risk, and I think this list, the way it's framed, kind of really gets at that.
Right. And, the 60s especially, like that was a time of incredible technological advancement,
Oh, yeah.
but also
Eventually, well, yeah.
hubris, right? Like
Yeah.
you were just like, oh, we can do anything.
Yeah, a lot of pushing the
And
limits.
the ocean's like, no, you can't.
Yeah.
So this list kind of reminded me of that.
Yeah, that's a good reminder.
And just even reading the intro, they talk about how, like, there were all these successes. Like, submarines were going under the ice. They were staying submerged for weeks at a time.
Yeah, like pushing the boundaries of what was possible.
Right. But then you have this, like, counterpoint, these 10 incidents that were like, whoa, hold on.
Yeah, a reality check.
Yeah.
Like a dose of reality.
Yeah. So let's dive into it.
Let's do it.
First one, 1960, the K-8 Soviet November class. I always love the names of these submarines, like November class.
Yeah, they sound cool, but also a little ominous.
Yeah, what does November class even mean?
So class, in naval terms, usually refers to a group of submarines or ships that share a similar design, purpose, capabilities. They're built kind of as a blueprint. So the November class were nuclear-powered attack submarines, part of the Soviet Navy.
Okay, so these are the big boys.
These are the big ones. The article mentions that they were known for being quite loud. For a submarine, that's not a good thing, especially if you're trying to be sneaky and stealthy.
Right. I mean, that's the whole point of the submarine, right?
Yeah, you want to be undetected. And these were apparently not known for being very quiet.
All right. Well, so much for stealth.
Yeah, not so much for stealth, but then it gets worse. Even beyond being noisy, the crew faced radiation risks because there was apparently not adequate shielding around the nuclear reactor.
So they're basically like getting cooked from the inside.
Yeah, pretty much. So even in routine operations, there was this inherent danger for the crew.
Okay, so not off to a great start.
Not a great start. And this is just routine operations, right? This is not even an incident yet.
All right, so this is like just another day at the office.
Yeah, just another day at the office, yeah.
For these guys.
Yeah.
And then in October of 1960, during an exercise in the Barents Sea,
Things go wrong.
things go wrong.
Yep.
They get leaks in critical piping and in the steam generators.
Right.
What does that, I mean, what does that even mean? Like, for someone who's not a nuclear engineer.
Yeah, so you've got this nuclear reactor, right? And it generates a tremendous amount of heat. That heat is used to create steam. And that steam drives turbines, which power the submarine. So the steam generators are a critical part of that whole system. They're basically heat exchangers that transfer the heat from the reactor coolant to water, creating steam. Now, if you get leaks in the piping or the steam generators themselves, you've got a couple of major problems. First, you're losing pressure in the system, which means the steam isn't going to be as effective in driving the turbines. You're losing power. Second, and potentially even more dangerous, you've got radioactive coolant potentially leaking out.
So basically, it's all bad.
It's pretty bad. It's a cascade of potentially bad things happening.
Yeah. So what happened? How did they deal with this?
So they tried to contain the leaks using the standard procedures, but it didn't work. And this is where it gets really interesting. They had to improvise.
Oh, I love a good diver moment.
Right.
Yeah.
They had to think on their feet, and what they did was they devised a system to directly feed water into the reactor to cool it down. And this is not how it's supposed to work. Nuclear reactors have a closed-loop cooling system. You don't just pump seawater directly into the reactor.
Right. I mean, it's not like a car engine, right?
It's not like a car engine. So this was a really risky move.
Yeah.
But it was also pretty ingenious, and it worked.
It worked.
It worked. They managed to prevent a nuclear meltdown, and a meltdown, just to be clear, that's like the worst case scenario.
Right.
That's when the nuclear chain reaction in the reactor core becomes uncontrolled. You
Right.
get this massive release of energy and radiation.
That's a Chernobyl. That's a Fukushima.
Yeah, it's a catastrophic event,
Hmm.
and they managed to avert that.
So they were heroes essentially.
Yeah, they absolutely were. They saved potentially countless lives by doing this. And there's always a but. It wasn't without consequences, right?
Right.
They were exposed to a lot of radiation during this whole process. The article mentions 3 of them suffered visible radiation injuries, and others registered high levels of exposure. So even though they averted disaster,
Right.
it came at a huge personal cost.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, okay. 1960, also
Yeah.
1960, Sargo II. This is an American submarine. And up until this point, this submarine had actually been having a really, really good year. They had done a lot of exploration of the Arctic Basin.
Yeah, they were pioneers in Arctic exploration,
They even reached the North Pole.
which is pretty incredible when you think about it.
It is. I mean,
They were under the ice, going to the North Pole.
Yeah.
1960. This is early days of nuclear submarines.
Yeah, yeah,
It really shows you what was possible with this technology.
yeah. So they had covered, get this, over 11,000 miles, more than half of which
Yeah, 6,003 of those miles were under the ice.
under the ice.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then June rolls around. They're docked, just minding their own business.
Yeah, just routine stuff, right?
Yeah.
You'd think.
And then boom.
Yeah, an explosion and fire in the stern room during oxygen tank charging.
How does it even happen?
So you gotta replenish the oxygen supply on a submarine, right? It's essential for the crew to breathe. And this process, it involves charging these big oxygen tanks, but it's a delicate process because oxygen is highly flammable.
Right.
So if you get a spark, a leak, anything like that, it can ignite. And that seems to be what happened here.
Yeah, it mentions one crew member was killed, and the Sargo II was in the shipyard for the entire summer getting repairs.
It's a reminder that even though this was a conventionally powered submarine, not nuclear, the dangers are still very real.
Yeah, you're still working with volatile materials.
Right. You're in this enclosed environment underwater.
Yeah.
So safety protocols, meticulous execution, those are absolutely critical.
Yeah, you can't be like, yeah, it's just oxygen. What's the worst that could happen?
No, oxygen's dangerous stuff.
All right, so 1961, we move on. We get to the K-19. Now, this one is famous.
Yeah, this is a big one.
This is the one that's had movies made about it.
Yeah, there was a movie with Harrison Ford
Yeah.
about the K-19.
And it's a wild story. This was the Soviet Union's first ballistic missile-equipped nuclear submarine.
So this was a big deal. They were trying to keep up with the U.S. in the nuclear arms race.
Right. This is the Cold War, right?
Yeah, this is peak Cold War. And the K-19, it was designed to carry these incredibly powerful ballistic missiles that could be launched from underwater, targeting other countries. It was a major step forward in their nuclear capabilities.
Right. And the Listverse article points out that the construction of the K-19 was rushed.
Yeah, and this is often the case, right? When you have this intense pressure to be first, to get ahead in a technological race, sometimes corners get cut. And it seems like that's what happened here.
Right. So even during the sea trials, there were already all kinds of problems popping up.
Yeah, it was plagued with malfunctions,
Yeah.
leaks, mechanical failures, you name it.
Yeah. And then while they're out in the North Atlantic, bam, they get a radioactive leak.
And this was a serious leak. It stemmed from a faulty pressure gauge, but there was also an underlying issue that wasn't even reported. That's really concerning.
Yeah. Why wouldn't they report it, do you think?
I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but you got to think about the context, right? This was the Soviet Union, very hierarchical, very strict. You didn't want to be the one reporting problems, especially on a flagship project like this.
Right. I mean, you didn't want to be the guy who held up the
exactly.
launch of the K-19.
The K-19, exactly.
Okay.
So there might have been this culture of, don't speak up, just fix it, don't make waves. And that could have contributed to this disaster.
Yeah, so they've got this radioactive leak, and then it gets worse. It leads to a fire, and they lose coolant for the reactor.
This is where it gets really, really dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, this is...
You lose coolant in a nuclear reactor, it can overheat.
Right.
And that can lead to a meltdown.
Which is, a big kaboom.
Yeah, a catastrophic event.
Yeah.
The whole thing could have exploded.
Right.
Released massive amounts of radiation into the environment. It would have been devastating.
Yeah. So what happened? How did they prevent this?
Okay, so this is where it gets heroic.
Yeah.
But also incredibly tragic. The crew, they knew what was at stake. They knew the risks. and they decided to improvise a cooling system. They used the submarine's drinking water,
They're drinking water.
their drinking water,
Yeah.
to cool down the reactor core. They basically jury-rigged this whole system, working in incredibly cramped radioactive conditions.
Yeah.
It was a desperate act of bravery, and it worked. They managed to stabilize the reactor, prevent a meltdown. But the cost was huge. 8 crew members died from radiation poisoning within weeks.
Yeah, and the article says that 22 more died within a few years.
Yeah, it's a long-term consequence of radiation exposure.
Mm.
These guys, they were heroes. They saved the world potentially from a nuclear disaster, but they paid the ultimate price.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow. Okay. Moving on. 1962, the B-37. This was a Soviet Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarine. What were these used for?
So the Foxtrot class were primarily used for anti-shipping and anti-submarine warfare. They were pretty standard diesel-electric submarines at the time, not nuclear-powered, but still very capable.
Right. So the B-37 was moored at this base, Polyarny Settlement Base, getting ready for a long cruise.
Yeah, just routine prep work.
Yeah, and then they're doing some inspections, turning the torpedoes.
And this is where things go horribly wrong.
Right.
A fire breaks out, followed by a massive explosion in the torpedo compartment.
Yeah, I mean, you got torpedoes,
Yeah,
right?
you've got a lot of explosives in that compartment.
Right.
And it seems like one of them detonated. And that set off a chain reaction.
Yeah. All 11 torpedoes on board, they all exploded.
It was a catastrophic explosion. It demolished the forward part of the submarine.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the submarine that was destroyed. It killed everyone on the dock, everyone at the nearby torpedo technical base. 122 people died.
Yeah, it was a devastating loss of life. It's still not entirely clear what caused the initial explosion, but one theory is that there was some mechanical damage to a torpedo during loading. And that just highlights the inherent dangers of working with these kinds of weapons.
Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with explosives.
Yeah, it's dangerous stuff. And in an enclosed environment like a submarine, the consequences of an accident can be absolutely catastrophic.
All right. Moving on to a name that's really synonymous with submarine tragedy, the USS Thresher, 1963. This was the world's first nuclear-powered submarine lost at sea.
Yeah, a landmark event in submarine history, but for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah. And the Thresher, it was the lead attack submarine of its class. It had advanced sonar capabilities. They were doing these deep diving tests off Cape Cod alongside the USS Skylark. Why were they doing deep diving tests?
Well, they were pushing the limits of the submarine's operational depth, seeing how deep it could go, testing its structural integrity.
Right, like how much pressure could it withstand?
Exactly. And at those depths, the pressure is immense, hundreds of pounds per square inch.
Yeah, so during these tests, the Skylark starts getting these really garbled messages from the Thresher. They mention a minor problem.
Yeah, which is never a good sign.
Never a good sign, no. And then the Skylark hears this sound that they describe as like a compartment collapsing.
That's the sound of the hull failing under pressure.
Yeah, so it's basically imploding.
Yeah, it's imploding, and there's nothing you can do at that point.
Right, you're done.
You're done. The pressure is so immense, it just crushes the submarine.
And then silence.
Yeah, the Thresher, it just vanished.
All 129 men on board. Yeah. They think that maybe faulty piping led to a loss of power, and then they couldn't blow the ballast tanks to surface.
Yeah, the ballast tanks are how a submarine controls its buoyancy.
Right.
They flood them with water to dive, and then they use compressed air to force the water out to surface.
Right.
If they lose power, they can't generate that compressed air.
So they're stuck.
They're stuck.
Yeah. It's just a really stark reminder of how unforgiving the ocean can be.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't matter how advanced your technology is. If something goes wrong at those depths, the consequences can be fatal.
Right. Moving on to 1965, the K-11. This is another Soviet November-class submarine. And this time, the problem happens during a refueling exercise. What's so dangerous about refueling a nuclear reactor?
So refueling a nuclear reactor, it's a very complex and delicate process.
Right.
You're dealing with highly radioactive materials,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong. And that's exactly what happened here. They were replacing the fuel rods in the reactor, and they had to lift the reactor tank lid. But they placed the lid incorrectly, and then they had to lift it again.
Right.
And during that second lift, a safety mechanism failed. It was a beam that was supposed to prevent the lid from being raised too high,
Right.
but it was positioned wrong. So they ended up lifting the control rods too far out of the reactor.
And what does that do?
That causes the reactor to go critical.
Right. And we talked about critical before. That's bad.
That's really bad. It means the nuclear chain reaction becomes uncontrolled.
Right.
You get a surge of heat and radiation.
Yeah, and it says that they had radioactive steam leaking out.
Yeah, so there was a breach in the reactor containment,
Right.
which is a major hazard for the crew.
Yeah, and this is all because they lifted the lid too high.
Yeah, it all stemmed from that initial error, and it gets worse. A few days later, during normal operations, the reactor goes critical again. Yeah, again. This time it overheats, releases more radioactive steam, and then the lid falls onto the reactor tank. And to top it all off, a fire breaks out in the reactor compartment.
Oh, come on.
It was a complete cascade of failures, all stemming from that initial mistake with the lid.
Yeah, that's a rough day at the office.
Yeah, no kidding. And the result was 7 crewmen suffering radiation injuries from exposure to the water they used to fight the fire.
So even trying to fix it, they were getting exposed to radiation.
Yeah, it was a really bad situation.
All right, so 1968. This is a year that the Listverse article calls the worst ever peacetime year in submarine history.
Not a good year to be in a submarine.
No, not at all. And we start off with the K-27. This was the Soviet Union's first and only Project 645 nuclear attack boat. And it had these advanced liquid metal-cooled reactors. What's so special about those?
So liquid metal-cooled reactors, they offered some potential advantages over traditional water-cooled reactors. They could operate at higher temperatures,
Right.
which meant more efficient propulsion. And they had higher power density, meaning they could generate more power in a smaller space.
Right.
But they also came with their own set of challenges. The liquid metal they used in this case, it was a lead bismuth alloy.
Okay.
It could solidify if it got too cold,
Yeah.
and it was corrosive.
Ah, so there were trade-offs.
Yeah, always trade-offs.
Yeah. So they were out, they were doing their thing, and one of the reactors failed. What happened?
So one of the VT1 reactors, it experienced a power drop, and then there was this huge increase in gamma radiation levels in the reactor compartment.
Yeah, gamma radiation, that's the nasty stuff.
That's the bad stuff. It can penetrate deep into tissue,
Right.
cause a lot of damage.
Yeah. And it says that radioactive gas spread to other compartments of the submarine.
Yeah, so the whole crew was being exposed.
Oh, wow.
And this is where it gets even more disturbing. The radiation detector in the reactor compartment, it was switched off.
Switched off.
Yeah, so they didn't even know the extent of the radiation leak at first. When they finally switched the detector back on, they realized just how dangerous the situation was.
And they had been breathing this in, essentially.
For hours.
For hours.
The article says the entire crew, 144 men, were exposed to this radiation for over 5 hours.
Oh, that's terrible.
It's awful. 9 men died from radiation poisoning.
Yeah.
And countless others suffered long-term health problems.
And the K-27, it was eventually decommissioned and scuttled in the Kara Sea. Why is that a problem?
So scuttling a nuclear submarine, it's not ideal. Even if they sealed the reactors, there's always the risk of corrosion.
Right.
And eventually, those radioactive materials could leak out into the environment.
Yeah. So it's basically a ticking time bomb.
Kind of, yeah. And
Yeah.
Kara Sea, it's already a heavily polluted area from Soviet-era nuclear waste.
Right, so they just kind of added to the problem?
Yeah, unfortunately.
All right. Another one from 1968, the INS Dakar. This was an Israeli Navy submarine. It was formerly a British submarine, the HMS Totem. They were sailing from Portsmouth, Scotland to Israel.
A long journey.
Yeah. They made a stop in Gibraltar, and then they just disappeared.
Yeah, it's a mystery.
Just gone.
Last transmission was on January 24th, and then nothing.
No Mayday, no SOS, just silence.
Yeah. They did pick up a possible SOS signal later, but it didn't lead to anything.
Yeah, they never found them.
At the time,
Right.
it was a complete mystery. They searched and searched, but no trace of the Dakar.
What were some of the theories at the time?
I mean, it was all speculation, right? Some people thought it was a collision, maybe with another submarine or a
Right,
ship.
right.
Others thought it could have been an equipment failure, maybe a catastrophic hull breach.
Right.
Some even thought it might have been sabotage.
Right, foul play.
Yeah. But no one knew for sure.
Yeah, and the wreckage was eventually found, like, decades later, in 1999.
Yeah, and it did provide some answers. It seems like there was a hull breach, but the exact cause is still unclear.
It's just wild that a submarine can just vanish like that.
Yeah, it really shows you the vastness and the power of the ocean.
Yeah. All right. Another one from 1968, the K-129. This is a Soviet nuclear ballistic missile submarine. And these missiles, they were packing some serious heat.
Yeah, the article says they had a yield of 1 megaton each.
1 megaton.
Yeah, that's a huge amount of destructive power.
Yeah, I mean, that's enough to wipe out a city.
Yeah, easily.
So the K-129, it was on patrol in the Pacific, and they were supposed to maintain radio silence for 2 weeks.
Yeah, part of their Cold War strategy, staying hidden, keeping the enemy guessing.
Right.
But after those 2 weeks, nothing. No radio transmissions, no sign of the submarine.
Gone.
Yeah. And the Soviets, they never really gave a clear explanation for what happened.
What did they say?
Officially, they said it slipped below its operating depth, flooded, and sank.
Okay, so basically pilot error.
Kind of, yeah. But a lot of people didn't buy it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a nuclear submarine with a bunch of nukes on board.
Right, and it just disappears. It doesn't add up.
Yeah. So what were some of the other theories?
Well, some people thought that maybe one of the missiles exploded on board,
Right.
which would have been catastrophic.
Right.
Others thought it might have collided with another submarine, maybe
Yeah.
an American submarine.
Right.
And there was even a theory that a hydrogen battery explosion might have been the cause.
Right. And the fact that the Soviets never recovered the wreckage just added to the mystery.
Yeah, it's still a big question mark in submarine history.
Yeah. And the last one on our list, also from 1968, the USS Scorpion. This was an American skipjack-class attack submarine. It had a history of special operations.
Yeah, so it was involved in some pretty sensitive missions.
Right. And it was on its way home to Norfolk, Virginia after operating with the Sixth Fleet.
So it had been out on deployment, doing its thing.
Yeah. And then it just went silent.
Yeah, they lost contact.
And they launched a huge search effort.
Massive search effort.
But they couldn't find it.
Not at first.
Right. And eventually, they declared it presumed lost.
Yeah, on June 5th.
With all 99 crew members.
Lost.
Yeah. And then, a few months later, they find the wreckage.
Yeah, well, west of the Azores.
But even after finding the wreckage, they still couldn't figure out what happened.
No, the exact cause of the sinking, it remains a mystery.
What were some of the theories?
Well, there was speculation about an internal explosion, maybe in the torpedo room
right.
or the battery compartment,
Right.
but they couldn't find any conclusive evidence to support those theories.
So it's basically another one of those question marks in submarine history.
Yeah, unfortunately. It's a reminder that even with all our technology and our safeguards, accidents can still happen.
Yeah. In 1968, I mean, 2 nuclear-powered submarines, one American, one Soviet, lost in the same year. That's got to be some kind of record, right?
Yeah, it's a grim record.
Yeah.
And it really underscores the dangers of operating in this environment.
Yeah. So we've gone through these 10 incidents, and it's a pretty sobering list.
Yeah, it's not a lighthearted topic.
No, not at all. But it's important, I think, to remember these stories, to honor the men who lost their lives.
Absolutely.
And to learn from these mistakes.
Yeah, because the lessons we learn from these incidents, they can help us prevent future accidents and make submarine operations safer.
Right, because even though those were all from the 1960s, submarines are still operating today.
Yeah, and they're even more complex, even more capable.
Right.
So the stakes are even higher now.
Yeah, I mean, we're not just talking about conventional weapons anymore. We're talking about nuclear weapons, potential for environmental disasters.
Yeah, it's something to think about, as we continue to push the boundaries of technology and exploration.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we're not invincible.
Yeah, the ocean is a powerful force.
And it demands respect.
Absolutely.
All right, well, on that cheery note.
Yeah, a little bit of a downer.
That's our deep dive into submarine incidents of the 1960s.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for sending me this list.
It was interesting to delve into, albeit a little bit dark.
Yeah, a little dark, but, hopefully we learned something from it.
Yeah, always good to learn from the past.
All right, well, until next time.
See ya.